I only meant to return the jump starter. That was the whole plan. Paige had lent it to me 2 weeks earlier on a Tuesday morning when it was -27 outside and my Civic wouldn't turn over. I'd knocked on her door at 7:15, already late for a stand-up call, and she came out in a thick parka and handed me the portable booster without making a thing of it. "Take as long as you need," she said, already turning back inside before I could finish thanking her. I'd been meaning to return it ever since, but work had been relentless in January, and every evening I thought about it something got in the way. A late call, groceries. The particular kind of tired that makes you sit down for 5 minutes, and then it's 11 o'clock. That Thursday evening I finally grabbed the thing off my kitchen shelf, walked the 12 feet between our front steps, and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and I understood within about 2 seconds that I had very bad timing. Todd was already in his coat. Full winter jacket, keys in one hand, face so tight I could see the muscles working in his jaw from the doorway. Paige was standing near the living room in her scrubs. She worked evening shifts at the Ottawa hospital, arms crossed over her chest, hair still up from a long day. A mug was on its side on the carpet near the coffee table. Whatever had been in it had soaked dark into the rug. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has walked into exactly the wrong room, at exactly the wrong moment. "Perfect," he said, barely audible. Then he stepped past me without another word, shoulder nearly clipping mine on the way out, and went down the front steps to the driveway. The door bounced off the frame behind him. Not a proper slam. Just hard enough to say everything he wasn't going to say out loud. Paige didn't move right away. She stood looking at the empty space where he'd been, jaw set, like she was waiting to make sure the sound actually meant he was gone. I stood in the doorway, still holding the jump starter. "I can come back," I said. She looked at me for a moment and let out a short breath that almost became a laugh. "No, come in." I stepped inside. The overturned mug was still on the carpet, handle broken clean off. "Can I help with that?" I nodded toward it. She looked down at it as if seeing it for the first time. "Sure!" I found paper towels in the kitchen. I'd been in her place twice before for the building's co-op maintenance meetings, so I knew roughly where things were. She picked up the mug. I pressed the towels down against the rug. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Then she said quietly, "He thinks I'm overreacting." I didn't answer right away. Todd and I had said maybe 50 words total in the year and a half we'd been neighbors. Seemed fine in passing, mostly distracted. Nodded at me from the end of his driveway, that kind of thing. I didn't know anything about their marriage. I only knew that once in October I'd heard raised voices through the shared wall while I was trying to watch the game, and I'd turned the volume up and gone to get a beer. "To what?" I asked. She sat down on the arm of the couch. "To the fact that he lied to me again." She didn't say it dramatically. She said it the way you say something when you've been turning it over so long it's gone smooth. "About what?" She looked toward the window. "He said he was in a project meeting until 9 last Friday. I called his office line at 8:40 to ask if he wanted me to grab dinner on the way home. Someone else answered. Said the building had been locked since 6. And his explanation." She gave me a flat, tired look, that I probably hit the wrong extension by accident. "Did you?" "No." She stood and walked to the kitchen. "You want tea? I need to do something with my hands." I followed her in and leaned against the counter while she filled the kettle. The kitchen was spotless. She was the kind of person who cleaned when she was stressed. I was beginning to understand. "This isn't the first time," she said without looking at me. "Since September he's been different. Gradually different, not all at once. I kept telling myself it was the contract renewal, the project pressure. I gave him every single benefit of the doubt." She set the kettle on its base and finally turned around. "But it's the small things. He puts his phone face down every time he walks into a room. Every time, Ian. Like it's a reflex now. He steps outside to take calls in November in Ottawa. Who does that voluntarily?" I thought about saying something and decided not to. "He told me he was meeting his friend Rob for lunch last month. I ran into Rob's wife at Loblaws the next day. She mentioned Rob had been out west the whole week, in Calgary for work. When I told Todd, he said I must have misunderstood her. She picked up a dish towel, turned it over in her hands, set it back down. That word keeps coming up, misunderstood." The kettle started to hiss. "And there was a charge on our visa," she continued. "A restaurant on Elgin Street, the kind of place you book a table at. He'd told me he was working late that Wednesday." She pulled 2 mugs down from the cabinet and poured without looking at me. "I haven't been taken for dinner downtown in over a year." She handed me a mug, her fingers grazed mine as I took it. She didn't notice, or she pretended not to, I noticed. Tell me honestly, she said, looking at me steadily over the rim of her cup. Did you ever notice anything? I know it's a strange question. It was a strange question, but it wasn't a wrong one. His truck's been gone earlier, I said carefully. Used to see it most mornings when I left for the gym. Since fall, sometimes it's gone before 6. Something moved across her face. Not surprise. The feeling of having a private suspicion confirmed by someone who had no reason to lie. Exactly, she said. We stood in that kitchen until nearly 10. By the time I put my empty mug in the sink, I'd understood that she wasn't just processing one bad fight. She'd been carrying a case inside her own head for months, building it alone, and tonight was the first time she'd let any of it out. When I got to the door, I stopped. For what it's worth, I said, you're not overreacting. She looked at me from the kitchen. Her face was careful, controlled, but something in it shifted at the edges. Thank you, she said. That actually matters more than you'd think. I went back to my place and stood at my kitchen counter for a while, not doing anything in particular. I'd meant to be home in 4 minutes. It was 5 to 10. She texted at noon the next day. Can I steal 20 minutes this afternoon? No rush. I was working from home. Our team was mostly remote after the office lease ran out, so I texted back, sure, anytime. She arrived at 2 with Tim Hortons, 2 large double-doubles. She remembered exactly how I took my coffee from a parking lot conversation we'd had in October. I didn't mention that. We sat at my kitchen table and she got straight to it. She had a small notebook with her. Dates written down, details, what he'd said compared to what she'd been able to verify on her own. She set it on the table between us without apology. I've been keeping track since November, she said. Because I knew if I ever had to say any of this out loud to someone, I needed it to be real and not just something I'd half remembered in a bad state of mind. She looked at me directly. So I want to tell you all of it, and I need you to tell me if it sounds like I'm building something from nothing. Okay, I said. She talked for 40 minutes, the perfume in October, twice different jackets. A hotel parking receipt from the East End on a day he'd said he was across the city. A Sunday morning coffee charge on Elgin Street when he'd told her he was driving out to his brother's in Almonte. Small gaps between what he said and what held up. Each one, alone, nothing. All of them together, something. And then she said, he has a second phone. I set my cup down. Rogers Prepaid. I found the box under the passenger seat in an old grocery bag in November. I photographed it and put it back exactly as I found it. She looked at her notebook. He hasn't mentioned it. He doesn't know I saw it. I sat with that for a moment. What do you want to do? I asked. She looked up. I want real proof, not me reading into receipts, something I can hold. I nodded slowly. I think that was the moment I stopped being the neighbor who'd listened politely out of decency and became something else. I wasn't certain what, exactly, but I knew I was staying in it either way. The close call happened 5 days later on a Tuesday evening. Paige had texted me when Todd left for what he'd called a client meeting. I'd come over, and we'd been sitting at the kitchen island for about an hour, going back through the timeline, when we heard tires on the driveway. He was back early, 40 minutes early. Paige moved before I even registered what was happening. She grabbed a folder from the counter drawer, house renovation quotes she'd been collecting, and pushed it across the island to me. Bathroom reno, she said, very low and fast. We're comparing quotes. Todd walked in and stopped. He looked at her, then at me, then at the folder open in my hands. I had never been so aware of my own expression in my life. I kept it neutral and held up one of the pages. This tile supplier out in Nepean seems way overpriced compared to the one she found in Canada, I said. You'd save probably $400 on just the floor tiles. He barely looked at the page. His eyes moved between us for a moment, and something in them wasn't quite suspicion, more like irritation, like I'd been around one too many times for his liking. Hey, he said finally. Then he went to the fridge and stood there looking into it. Paige picked up her own coffee mug and took a calm sip as if she'd been doing it all afternoon. He took a drink, went upstairs without saying anything else. After a few seconds, Paige let out a slow breath through her nose. She didn't look at me. She just said very quietly, thanks. You moved fast, I said, equally quiet. She looked at the folder. I've had that in that drawer for 3 weeks. She glanced up at me, just in case. If you're still here, drop a like. It only takes a second and it means a lot. I want to keep telling stories like this one. She wasn't improvising. She'd been preparing. That told me more about the weight she'd been carrying than anything she'd said out loud. The following Tuesday, he told her he was meeting a supplier for dinner and would likely be back by 10. She texted me at 5:51. He's lying again. Left 20 minutes ago. I know where he said he'd be and I already know he's not going there. I had my keys in my hand before I finished reading. She was waiting at the door. We took my car. She'd remembered the direction he'd gone, south toward the Queensway, and we picked up his truck near the Hunt Club interchange. The familiar dent in the back left bumper. He wasn't headed toward any supplier. He was going east into the city, taking the route toward the Glebe. Paige sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the taillights ahead of us, not saying much. He parked on a side street off 5th Avenue. We pulled over half a block behind him and cut the lights. The street was quiet. Residential older homes, a couple of low-profile hotels tucked between apartment buildings. That's not a supplier meeting, Paige said. No, I said. We watched him lock the truck, check his phone twice, one of them, I was certain, the second one, and walk toward a converted Victorian building on the corner. Small brass plaque on the door, 6 steps up to the entrance. Paige went very still. I know that hotel, she said. The quality of her voice had changed, not louder or softer, just flatter. We stayed there our first week in Ottawa, 8 years ago when we were still looking for an apartment. It was the only place we could afford that didn't feel depressing. I didn't say anything. There wasn't a thing to say. We waited. I watched the dashboard clock. 17 minutes passed. The engine ticked as it cooled. Then the front door opened. Todd came down the steps with a woman beside him. Dark coat, hair pulled back, maybe early 30s. They weren't holding hands. They didn't need to. They walked together with the kind of ease that doesn't get built in a week, that settled, unconscious closeness that only comes from time. She laughed at something he said, touched his sleeve for just a moment before she turned toward a waiting cab. He watched until she was gone. Then he pulled out the second phone and stood there on the steps typing while the cab turned the corner. Beside me, Paige let out one long, quiet breath. 7 months, she said, at minimum. You can't know. I'm a nurse, Ian. She said it gently, not sharply. I've spent 9 years reading what's actually happening under what people say is happening. I knew in October. She looked at the hotel door. I just needed to stop waiting for a version of this that didn't hurt. She looked at me then and her eyes were wet, but her voice was completely level. I want to go in, she said, once. I need to actually see it. I thought about talking her out of it. I looked at her face and understood that there was no version of this where she'd feel settled, without closing this door herself, with her own eyes. Okay, I said. We went in through the side entrance. The lobby was small and warm. I asked the woman at the front desk about parking validation while Paige moved to the elevator and pressed a floor. We went up to the second floor and walked slowly. Paige listened at each door we passed. Near the end of the corridor, she stopped. His voice. Low and unhurried, the relaxed version she told me later she hadn't heard at home since sometime last spring. She stood outside that door without touching it. I looked at her and gave her one last chance to walk away. She shook her head once. Then the door opened from inside. Todd stepped into the hall mid-sentence, looking back over his shoulder, and then he turned and saw us. The sentence stopped. His face changed completely, not one expression but several moving through at once before settling on something blank and caught. He looked at Paige, then at me, then back at Paige. The woman appeared in the doorway behind him. She looked between them and went pale. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Paige said very quietly, "How was the supplier meeting?" He opened his mouth, nothing came. "I drove past your office building last Friday evening," she said. "The lights were off. I found the Rogers box in November. I know about the Elgin Street dinner. I know about the parking receipt from the East End." She paused. "I know about this hotel. You brought me here when we first moved to Ottawa. I don't know whether you thought I wouldn't remember, or whether you just didn't think at all." He reached toward her. "Paige, just let me." "No," one word. Flat and final, like a door closing on a room she wasn't going back into. "I don't need an explanation. I've already worked it out." She looked at the woman in the doorway for one brief moment, not with anger, with something more like recognition. I needed to see it. She turned and walked back down the corridor. I didn't look at Todd, I just followed her. He called after her once from the hallway, then again louder from the elevator bank. She didn't slow down. We pushed through the side entrance and the cold hit us both immediately. -14, maybe colder near the river. The city was quiet, the street lit orange under the street lamps, a thin skin of fresh snow on the pavement. Paige pulled her coat closed and tilted her head back and looked at the sky for a moment, just breathed. "I already called a lawyer," she said, "this afternoon before we left." I looked at her. Family law firm on Metcalf Street. The consultation is Monday morning. She exhaled slowly, a white cloud in the cold air. I wanted the evidence in case the process required it. But I already knew what I was going to do. She looked at me sideways. I just needed to stop being the person who wasn't sure. We walked back to the car. I didn't say anything and she didn't seem to need me to. The drive back to Barhaven took almost half an hour. Light traffic, clear roads, the suburbs getting quieter the further west we went. She looked out the window most of the way. I kept my eyes on the highway. When I pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine, she didn't move right away. Sat there with her hands in her lap, the heat already fading. I sat there too. After a long moment she turned and looked at me. Really looked at me, in the way she'd first done that Thursday night in her kitchens, when she'd said thank you and meant it differently than the word usually means. I have a very long road ahead of me, she said. Yeah, I said, but you know where it starts. She nodded slowly. Then she reached over and put her hand on mine for just a moment. Not long, just long enough. She got out, walked up her front steps and went inside. I watched her door close and the light come on in her hall. I sat there in the cold a little longer. The parking lot was still. Somewhere down the street a snowplow made its slow pass. I thought about 2 weeks ago when I'd almost left the jump starter until the weekend. I thought about 12 feet of sidewalk and a door opening at exactly the wrong time that had turned out not to be the wrong time at all. Paige had already made her decision before we'd left the house that evening. She'd already done the hardest part alone, quietly, in her own way, the way she seemed to do everything. She'd just needed someone to stand beside her, while she let herself stop pretending she didn't know what she knew. I hadn't planned any of it, not a single step past the first one. But I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be.